I'm Steve Scott. Without doubt, one of the most terrifying category of killers is the psychopath. Often incredibly difficult to catch, they commit murders without emotion, feeling, neither remorse nor guilt for their crimes. They're skilled liars, seemingly charming and intelligent, fooling family and friends with ease. For these reasons, many psychopaths can go on murdering for years. Remember Dr. Harold Shipman. It's thought he was responsible for more than 250 deaths. Tonight, we delve into the crime archives to look at two other men who became cold-blooded killers. Archibald Hall was a petty crook who, while serving time, reinvented himself as a debonair butler and a darling of the aristocracy. With his handsome good looks, impeccable manners and his flamboyant bisexual lifestyle, he was assured an easy entree into London's celebrity gay scene. But behind the facade, he was a cold-blooded killer, and once Hall had shot dead his first victim, there was no turning back. The mad butler was on the loose. Nick Martin takes up the story.
In January 1978, two men checked into this hotel in North Berwick, 16 miles east of Edinburgh. One was Archibald Hall, also known as Roy Fontaine. The other was Michael Kitto. Behind them lay a trail of murder on both sides of the border. One person in Dumfriesshire, one in London, another in the Scottish Highlands, and two in Cumbria. But this hotel is where it all came to an end. Archibald Hall was later revealed as one of Britain's most notorious serial killers. Archibald Hall was born in Glasgow on the 17th of July 1924. He grew up with his mother, Maisie, and father, a postal clerk also called Archibald, on the south side of the city.
His father was a hard-working man, and he went to school locally, but he seemed to have led his own life from he was probably 10 or 12. It may have been the company with whom he mixed, it may have just been something that was within him. But I know he got into the hands of the police quite young for theft, and I think that my late father at one stage had him in custody for something or other, I cannot remember which. But he was a fraudster and a confidence trickster and a thief.
Hall's quite a disturbed man, or was quite a disturbed man. I mean, he grew up as a child in Glasgow and very quickly became involved in developing a persona which he wanted rather than the actual persona he had. I think in simple short terms we'd refer to him as a psychopath. I think he never matured from childhood, and he saw people as things to use as opposed to people to relate to, and I think that sums up his personality.
In many ways, Archibald Hall was, I suppose, a prisoner of his own background. He hated the name Archibald. He restyled himself Roy Fontaine, that was his alias, and he called himself after the film star Joan Fontaine.
Well, it's a bit like a child in a sense when you change your name or you change your persona, because what you're doing is creating a world that you can manage and you can control as opposed to the real world, so that if you change your name, you become somebody else. I tend to call it like that children's programme Mr. Ben, where he puts on different outfits and different uniforms, goes through a door and becomes somebody else. I think in this case, Fontaine, Hall, whatever he called himself, was that person.
Archibald Hall, or Roy Fontaine as he now styled himself, moved in London underworld circles. As a jewel thief, he was able to live the life he aspired to, in between spells in prison. By the time he was 53, he'd spent over 19 years behind bars for various crimes, none of which, it's believed, had involved violence. Then, on the 31st of May 1977, Archibald Hall arrived here at Carlisle Station. He travelled from London to take up a job as a butler at the home of a Lady Peggy Hudson in Dumfriesshire.
She was the widow of former Conservative junior minister and lived in this mansion, large mansion, at Kirtleton near Waterbeck. She had employed him on the strength of a reference from what she believed to be a former employer. It turned out that the letter was written by his father-in-law, who was, like himself, a jailbird. However, when he started in the job, she was very impressed with him. He was most mannerly, efficient, and very attentive to her needs.
He was accepted as a respectable member of the community. He was popular in the pubs because he'd buy and drink. He always would command the money. He would only be being paid about £10 a week, you know. He dressed the country gentleman. He acted the country gentleman. He was very much an upmarket butler. He could con anyone.
Everybody looked on him as a very suave sort of chap. The local publican described him as a dandy. He always was impeccable in his dress and his manners, and seemed to be the sort of prototype butler. You know, was always well-spoken, well-dressed, well-mannered. Nobody could have guessed from his outward appearance that he was a sadistic killer.
In the late summer of 1977, a man called David Wright was taken on by Lady Hudson as a gardener. Wright was already known to Archibald Hall.
David Wright was an ex-cellmate of Hall, I believe, and he came down to Kirtleton. Wright got a bit too big for his boots in Hall's estimation.
Wright told Archie, or Roy Fontaine as he was by now, if he didn't give him some money, he was going to tell Lady Hudson exactly who her butler was. So Lady Hudson trotted off to London, and while she was away, Roy Fontaine took Mr. Wright rabbit shooting, and Wright managed to shoot a rabbit, but in so doing he emptied his .22 rifle. So Archie then took the rifle, reloaded it, and shot Wright 6 times in the head and the body.
Hall buried him in the bed of a stream on the estate, and he was a very meticulous man in every way, Hall, and he went to great lengths to ensure that the body could not be found.
So, Hall had already murdered in a bid to keep his identity a secret. It wasn't long before he was to kill again. Join me in a few moments. Welcome back to Night Watch. Jailbird Archibald Hall had hoped to go straight after becoming a butler to an aristocratic old lady, but his plans were in ruins after he shot dead a former cellmate who threatened to expose him.
When Wright turned on him and put at risk his nice canny role as a butler in this country house, and he started killing then because he realised that he had to get rid of Wright, otherwise his career was at stake. And although he'd stuck as a jewel thief before that, that then seemed to let loose in him this spree of killing.
Lady Hudson became increasingly suspicious of Hall, and one day received an anonymous phone call warning her about the butler. As a result, Hall was fired in September 1977. After he was sacked by Lady Hudson, Archibald Hall headed across the border to Cumbria to the small village of Newton-Arlosh, just a few miles west of Carlisle. He rented a cottage just down the road from this pub, and it was here, at the Joiners Arms, where he seemed to spend most of his time. Hall was also scouring the papers for a job as a butler. In October, he found what he was looking for. Walter Travers Scott Elliott, an 82-year-old former Labour MP, and his wife Dorothy wanted a butler at their London home. Hall got the job, and while there, met up with two old friends in the King's Cross area. First, Mary Coggle, also known as Belfast Mary, and later Michael Kitto, a small-time thief who inhabited the twilight world of London Soho. The three then plotted to rob the Scott Elliots.
Mrs. Scott Elliott was supposed to be in hospital, and they gave Mr. Scott Elliott drugged whiskey, and he fell asleep. So while they were going through the house, they went into Mrs. Scott Elliott's bedroom, and lo and behold, she wasn't in hospital. She was in fact in the bedroom, and cracked up when she saw not only her butler, but this strange man. And she shouted and bawled and was going to get the police, and the end of the story was they took a pillow and they both held it over her face and suffocated her.
After they'd killed Dorothy Scott Elliott, they put her body in the boot of their car. With the heavily drugged Walter Scott Elliott sitting on the back seat, Mary Coggle, wearing Mrs. Scott Elliott's fur coat, sat alongside him, pretending to be his wife. Then they drove to Scotland. Much later, near the village of Braco in Perthshire, they buried Mrs. Scott Elliott's body in a shallow grave. Then, with her husband still sedated and unaware of her death, the car headed for Newton-Arlosh in Cumbria for a night at Hall's cottage. The next day, Hall, Kitto, Mary Coggle and Walter Scott Elliott left Newton-Arlosh to drive to Scotland. It would only be a matter of days before another murder took place. On December the 14th, just a few days after Mrs. Scott Elliott's murder, Hall and Kitto killed her husband. They drove him to a remote part of Scotland near Inverness, where they strangled him and beat him with a spade. They then buried him in a shallow grave. So far there'd been 3 murders, yet none of the bodies had been discovered. Hall, Kitto and Coggle were now back in Newton-Arlosh, free to lead the high life from the proceeds of their crimes. Coggle was to be the next victim.
Mary Coggle was, I suppose, the gangster's moll of this story. She'd met Kitto and Hall in London underworld circles, and she took a shine to Lady Scott Elliott's fur coat, which they'd got hold of, and she wore it on the journey, and she hardly took it off when they arrived here at the cottage at Newton-Arlosh. Hall wanted the coat, being the sort of person he was. He wanted to sell it. He saw a quick profit in the coat, but for Mary Coggle, this was, I suppose, an example, a taste of the high life, and she wanted to keep it. She persuaded Hall to make love to her on the fur coat. Hall thought that if he did that, then he might be able to get hold of the coat later on and fence it away somewhere. But there was still a terrible argument between the two of them. She was killed here at the cottage, and after that, Hall just came here for a drink, and no one knew the full story.
He then put her in the boot of the car and drove across the border, and at Middleby they dumped her over a bridge into a wee burn.
I was in duty about 10 o'clock in the morning. We got a phone call from somewhere that a tractor driver had been travelling down the Middleby to Waterbeck Road, and he saw a body in a stream.
The woman's body, discovered on Christmas Day 1977, was identified as Mary Coggle. The bodies of David Wright and Mr. and Mrs. Scott Elliott were still to be found. Meanwhile, Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto were spending their time between London and Newton-Arlosh.
Archibald Hall had a younger brother called Donald, who'd also entered into a life of crime. And the last time he was released from prison, he headed here to Newton-Arlosh to find his brother and Michael Kitto. And he spotted the way in which they were free spenders here at the Joiners' Arms. He became very jealous of this apparent lifestyle they had, lauding it in this small community. And arguments developed between the two brothers. And one evening, that Archibald Hall and Michael Kitto got Donald Hall and they tied him to a chair and they tried to cover his face with a rag with chloroform in it in a bid to asphyxiate it. And Donald Hall died. Thinking they could do nothing about the body here in the village and they had to conceal it, they put Donald Hall's body into the boot of the car and headed north to Scotland.
Hall was superstitious about the number 999, so before they drove north, they changed the number plates on the car. In fact, it was to the Blenheim House Hotel in North Berwick that Hall and Kitto drove. Having checked into the hotel, they came to the restaurant and ordered themselves a bottle of wine. They had a meal, and by the time they were finishing off their brandies, the police arrived.
I was at home when I received a telephone call from the police at North Berwick, basically to the effect that two people had booked into the Blenheim Hotel. The hotelier had not been happy and had called the local police. The local police had gone along and they were suspicious about the car, which apparently had false plates on. They had taken the car back to the station and subsequently it appeared that a body was found there in the boot of the car.
Hall and Kitto were taken into custody. Shortly after their arrest, Tom McLean had a conversation with Kitto he'd never forget.
They were taken to Haddington police station where the Sheriff Court is adjacent to. And the following day, while I was over there, someone came to me and said that Michael Kitto wanted to speak to me. And Kitto came away with the phrase, I'll always remember it, you're never going to believe this, but there's another 3 bodies. And quite honestly, it was a wee bit hard to believe. He was very relaxed about the whole thing. And as I say, he appeared calm all the way through. I was of the opinion, and I still am, that Kitto was very, very happy to speak about the whole situation because in my mind and in his mind, he was going to be the next victim.
Kitto went along with the murders because in some ways he was a very dependent personality and he'd become attached to Hall. He'd seen Hall in action, probably didn't want to cross him as well, he wanted to stay alive, but also he recognised that this was a man that he could have a relationship with who would protect him, look after him and care for him as long as he was useful to him, so he went along with the crimes that Hall was committing.
Between them, they painted this picture of a nightmare murder trail which went from a high-class area of London ending up in Inverness, and there was bodies everywhere. They tied in Belfast Mary to it, and suddenly The police in Scotland had murder charges, and Scotland Yard were informed.
While police were searching for the bodies of David Wright and Mr. and Mrs. Scott Elliott, journalists were arriving in Newton Arlosh.
Here in Newton Arlosh, I don't suppose any of us were quite aware of how big a story this was. The police officers that we spoke to gave us some indication of what had happened in other parts of the country, and it soon became clear to us that we were on the coattails of a huge national, indeed international, story. What sort of men were they? How would you describe them?
I'm amazed. I can't imagine either of the two blokes murdering anybody, if this is what has happened. They're out of type completely.
When we did the interview here in the pub, he described them as people who were gentlemanly, very companionable, got on very well with people here in the local community, and weren't slow to spend their money behind his bar.
Gentlemen, I would say. Well dressed, immaculately dressed, best of manners. I wish I had a pub full of them.
By Sunday the 22nd of January 1978, the bodies of all 5 of Archibald Hall's victims had been recovered. All through the police investigation, Hall had shown no remorse. It would be a few months before the cases came to court. Because murders had been committed on both sides of the border, Hall and Kitto faced 2 trials, one here at the High Court in Edinburgh, the other at the Old Bailey in London. Hall and Kitto were first tried in Edinburgh in May 1978. Hall for the murders of Walter Scott Elliott and David Wright, Kitto for the murder of Walter Scott Elliott. They were both sentenced to life imprisonment.
Michael Kitto was 39, and when the judge sentenced him, he turned to Archie in the dock and he said, "Well, Gov," he said, "they say life begins at 40, and that was the end of them in Scotland. They were both transferred to custody of the Metropolitan Police, and from there they went to the Old Bailey.
At the Old Bailey in London, Michael Kitto was given a life sentence for the murders of Donald Hall, Mary Coggle and Mrs. Scott Elliott, with a recommendation that he serve at least 15 years. Archibald Hall was given a life sentence with no parole for the 3 murders. He died in prison on the 16th of September 2002.
You don't get remorse in somebody who's a psychopath, mainly because they don't see that they've actually done anything wrong. Because what they've done has been expedient. It suited the moment. It suited the whatever happened at that situation. He didn't see himself as having done anything wrong. So you can't show remorse. If you can't feel guilt, you can't show remorse.
So, a lack of remorse, one of the classic signs of a potential psychopath. In his autobiography, A Perfect Gentleman, Hall called himself cold and completely heartless, a phrase that chillingly describes our next serial killer. Join me in a few moments.